82% of YC companies are started remote or hybrid last quarter. Pre-COVID, 16% of companies were being started remote or hybrid. When you look at corporate America, Fortune 500 companies as an example, that is a complete reversal. The executive team actually wants to work remotely. The employees want to work remotely. It's the management layer that doesn't want to have their employees work remotely. Managers are no longer needed as much as they were pre-pandemic, particularly if you're running a hybrid work environment. And therefore, they need to transition to a more of a leadership model than a management model. And I do think that there's a very clear difference between those two. And a lot of managers are saying, I don't want to.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Remote work more than tripled during the last few years, and while the numbers aren't at their pandemic peak, remote work is clearly here to stay, especially if Liam Martin has anything to say about it. Liam has been an expert on remote work for over 2 decades, long before it became a household term. As the co-organizer of the world's largest remote work conference called Running Remote, he urges all organizations, new and old, to adopt remote or hybrid models to remain competitive and sustainable. His latest book, Running Remote, supports his mission to make remote work accessible for every person around the world, one employee and one company at a time. In this episode, Liam and I discuss the evolution of remote work and where it's headed, a manager's role in remote or hybrid work, and the hurdles of transitioning a traditional company to distributed work. We also talk about the Running Remote annual conference, how to build a culture of asynchronous work, effective process documentation necessary for remote work, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Work for Humans wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you for joining us today, and now I bring you my conversation with Liam Martin. Liam Martin, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you for having me, Dart. I am very excited to be here.
You have been an evangelist for remote ways of working since before the pandemic. And in fact, quite a while before.
That was a rare group, by the way. That was a rare group. I definitely was doing it before it was cool. I can tell you that for sure.
How has the ride been over the last couple of years?
Terrifying. The last 3 years have been nuts. I mean, you know this too, obviously, being in the space, but I have been working remotely in some context for almost 20 years. My very first business that I started right out of grad school, I was going to get a PhD in grad school. I'm looking at my master's degree right now, so I did not get the PhD. I got the POP prize, which was a master's. I ended up teaching a class because most graduate students teach first and second year university courses. And I started with 300-ish students, I believe, and we ended up with less than 150 by the end of the semester. I got the worst academic reviews in the history of the department. And the department had been in operation for 128 years, McGill University. And I remember stepping into my supervisor's office and I said, I don't think I'm very good at this. And he said, no, you're not. And I said, so what do you think I should do with the rest of my life? He said, well, you got to get pretty good at this teaching thing if you want to follow up on academia. So either figure out how to get good at this or figure out something else to do. 6 weeks later, I threw a master's thesis under his door. I was out into the real world. And the first business that I started from that was an online tutoring company, which was remote, because I realized that you could actually, instead of tutoring kids in an office environment or at the university, I could actually get twice as many sessions in if I just did it remotely. And this was, Zoom didn't exist. This was like Skype, kind of worked sometimes, didn't work some other times. That was 2007, 2008, and built that into a nice little business, which ended up going relatively well. We ended up having we had about a couple dozen tutors throughout North America and Europe that were running that business. But that was teaching me a lot about remote work. And for me, it was something that I was very passionate about from the get-go. And now we've built multiple businesses from there, Staff.com, Time Doctor, Running Remote, which is what we really want to talk about here. And all of those tie into a core mission that we have, which is empowering the world's transition towards remote work. So for us, we believe that it's important to be able to give everyone the opportunity to work remotely if they'd like to. And so our goal is to produce a world in which that's possible for every single man, woman, and child on the planet. And that has been a wild ride because the last 16, 17 years of remote work were nothing in compared to the last three. And any single quarter that I'm thinking about over the last 3 years has been more exciting than the last 15 years in which I've been working remotely. So a lot of exciting stuff has been happening. I mean, the biggest one just being COVID producing this Pandora's box that's been opened that I don't think will be shut ever. I think we're never going to go back to pre-COVID office world. And I think a lot of corporate America is coming to terms with that over the next 18 months.
When did the conference start running remote? And what was its attendance before the pandemic? And what is its attendance today?
So 2017, I was sitting with some of our team for some of our SaaS products. And Igor, who is now the person that runs Running Remote, I would essentially say he's the CEO of Running Remote at this point. And we were sitting down and we were trying to figure out, we had about 150 people at that point, and we said, how do we get to 500 people? How do we get to 1,000? How do we get to 2,000 people? Remote. No information. Lots of information on how to hire a virtual assistant, right? Very much kind of Tim Ferriss 4-hour work week type of stuff, which, I mean, I love Tim Ferriss and 4-hour work week, but that wasn't building a $1 billion company, right? That wasn't how you scale a $1 billion organization. And so I knew that there were a lot of friends of mine that had this same passion. A few of them are like Joel Gascoigne from Buffer, who was one of the first guys that really was advertising how to run a multi-million-dollar remote first organization. Or Amir from Doist, who runs a massive company called Todoist, which is a task management app that has millions and millions of customers all over the world. So I spoke to those guys and I said, do you guys want to learn more about this? And they said, yeah, we very much want to do this. And I said, listen, I'll pull a ready, fire, aim philosophy. I'll just book a venue in 9 months if you can come and speak at it. And they all said yes. And 9 months later, we ended up actually breaking even on that conference. It was 260 people, which was great for 2017. 2019, I believe we had maybe close to 500, 600 people. And then 2020, we were actually expecting to have 1,000 people for Austin, which was going to be a great location for us. But then COVID happened because the conference was actually happening in April.
Which is funny because you could almost go out of business with something like that happening, where you book a venue and you have all the sunk cost and then it explodes, and you could go out of business when you were the most demand thing on the planet right then.
Oh, and we did. Yeah, we went completely out of business. I lost hundreds of thousands of dollars on that. And because we have other SaaS products and other businesses, we were able to actually keep that business alive. But the P&L on that, and we actually disclose our P&Ls. We publish them publicly every year at the end of every event, inspired in part by Joel from Buffer, to be able to just keep that openness, particularly with the community, to be able to say, this is what we're currently doing. You know, it's like, this is not something that I'm running this is not a very profitable business for us. I think probably our best case is make a 10% margin, which is not something that I would necessarily apply my time to if I wasn't very passionate about remote work. But yeah, from April, we lost, I think the overall losses were over 300,000. And thankfully, these people can't sue us now, or hopefully they won't listen to this podcast. But there were a lot of, like, the hotel chain, which I shall not mention, was going to sue us because we were planning on canceling the conference, because we saw this back happening in like January, February. And we said, we're not going to be able to do this for April. Like, this is not going to happen. And they wanted to sue us. The state of Texas wanted to sue us. The city of Austin wanted to sue us because they said, well, you can't cancel this conference because it's not going to create a feeling of confidence towards the event industry. And I said, you're never going to have this event happen. It's all collapsing in on itself. Anyways, long story short, South by Southwest, which is the massive conference in Austin, Texas. They ended up canceling. And then I just said, we're pulling the trigger. I had already created all of the emails and the video address and all that kind of stuff. We fired it off. And thankfully, I think everyone but maybe 24 ticket holders said, hold on to your money. We said we will give every single person a refund. And we had 24 people that requested a refund out of 700 people, which was really great for us and really kind of showed that the community was excited about it. But what we ended up doing actually 3 months later is we transitioned into a online event. So we just raised money for charity at that point. We gave it to the Red Cross, and we had 20,000 people show up to that event, which was absolutely insane. So it was, you're right, like there's this informational vacuum of no one knows how to manage remote teams, and yet I can't actually monetize that information in any way. So we just said, we're basically going to act like an NGO, and we're going to say, how can we disseminate this information as quickly as humanly possible to as many people as possible? So an online conference was the best way to do it. And then wrote a book in conjunction with that, which obviously takes a lot longer to be able to get out there. Started producing a lot of videos. I mean, I was working 12-hour days for 6 months post-COVID. Like a lot of other people in the remote work world, we all agreed that our train was coming to the station, and we had to take up this opportunity to be able to show our best foot forward, recognizing where remote work could go, and that it's not just an emergency situation for right now. It is a long-term business model.
How big is the event that's happening in Lisbon in this coming April now? This is a mixed in-person and virtual, right? It's both.
Yeah. So our in-person is probably going to be close to 1,000 people. And then our virtual is usually at least double that. The interesting thing about virtual events is everyone was very excited about virtual events the first 6 months of COVID. And then we literally saw an exponential drop in that demand curve where we realized like, hey, listen, no one wants to kind of sit on their computer and watch presentations. They want that interaction effect. And that's also a really good corollary to remote work. You know, for us, remote work is not just people working on Zoom 24/7 and never talking to each other in person. It is doing company retreats. It's doing team meetups. It's doing all these types of things. So we kind of see running remote as the retreat for experts on remote work to be able to learn more and better about remote work. And then we have a whole bunch of virtual events that kind of work around that schedule to be able to make sure that everyone's got the best information that they have moving forward, which literally changes every week in this industry. So we got a lot of people working on it.
So I want to get in, and I have one more question before we get into it, but I really want to get into the contents of your book, Running Remote. And in part because something you just said is very related to that, which is being a remote friendly, even if you're not a remote first company, is more than giving everybody a Zoom account. It runs a lot deeper in terms of behaviors, in terms of culture. But before we get to that, while we're still on the topic of the conference, because I think this is such a phenomenon, what are you seeing in terms of the buildup of the infrastructure to support remote? And maybe we need a few definitions here first. There's remote, and there's lots of flavors of remote. One flavor of remote is 3 days a week, I work someplace besides the office. One flavor of remote is I am in a jungle in Peru. One version of remote is I don't have a fixed location. I'm completely a digital nomad and I'm moving around. And each of them has specific challenges. And maybe there's other flavors that I'm not thinking of. So first of all, what are the big flavors? And then what are we seeing in terms of the infrastructure that's rising up?
Well, I think you laid them out quite well. And there's advantages and disadvantages to each. Maybe I can frame this in the context of where I thought things were going to go and where things currently are, because I think that's a good way to kind of conceptualize this. February of 2020, 4% of the US workforce was working remotely, approximately. There's a couple data sets that'll say there's like a 1 to 2 point variation in that assessment, but generally that's where it was sitting. Post-COVID, 1 month later in March, 45% of the US workforce was working remotely. We had a peak at approximately 65% that 1 month later, but That is literally the biggest transition in work since the Industrial Revolution. But the Industrial Revolution took about 80 years, and we did that in March. So a complete reorganizing of politics, social interactions, how we work with people, our economies, and we didn't really understand what was happening in that moment because we were terrified by this virus that was front page news. And then on page 7, it was, and we're all working from home. But the long tail of that is we've produced all of these massive implications that I think we're going to have to take, to be honest with you, the rest of the decade to really unpack. You brought up digital nomadism, right? There was an argument once to be able to say that there would be 1 billion digital nomads. I completely disagree with that. I actually think that the vast majority of the population does not want to pursue digital nomadism. And for the 7 people that probably don't know what that is, that listen to your podcast, it's people that are location independent and they do their work essentially from anywhere. So they can be in Istanbul or they can be in Jakarta or Singapore or Bali. It doesn't really matter. And I thought that there was going to actually be like a bit of a Cambrian explosion of location independent workers. And I thought that also by extension, you were actually going to get a much larger access to, and this really hasn't happened yet, to the global South having access to bigger and better working opportunities. Because when the US guy from San Francisco ends up being a digital nomad and you still hire that person, well, why wouldn't I hire the local guy from Jakarta as an example in combination with that? That hasn't really happened yet. I don't really know why it hasn't, but that is something that we need to kind of work out. So the digital nomad kind of future, I don't think is going to happen. There has been a big shift, but it hasn't been anywhere close to what a lot of the industry experts were actually suggesting. The real reality of remote work, which I would almost kind of call flexible work, that's probably the best term to use for it, is people that work 1 to 5 days remote and they work in the office. And really, it's boiling down to collaboration time is spent generally synchronous, meaning in an office, in an on-premise environment. And then your IC work, your individual contribution work, where you can actually be a lot more productive by working from home, is done generally from home. That seems to be the model that the majority of the market is taking. There is a bit of a kind of caveat inside of it, which is the current fight right now is flexible versus inflexible. So flexible meaning, let's just decide when we want to come into the office. Like we'll leave it up to every single worker to define when they want to come into the office. And inflexible is on Mondays, we have meetings. You must report to the office on Mondays to do those meetings, because if even one person out of the 8 people in the group is missing, it creates a feedback loop that we don't want. And I don't know. I can tell you which one I want. I want the completely flexible version. Obviously, that's the one that I'm really excited about and the vision that I have long term for remote work. But I don't actually know which one produces the best corollary to the previous world that we had inside of remote, because we've got all of these 20th century companies from a managerial philosophy that have been pushed forward into the 21st century in a month. And they need that time to be able to process that and work it out. And I don't think it's going to take a year or 2 years. I think it's going to take 5+ years for us to really figure out where we're going.
The feedback loop that you just mentioned, one I know of, which is if there's nobody at work, why would I go to work? And so one feedback loop is if I'm completely flexible and I get there and I'm alone so that I can talk to people on video, why am I going? Is that the main feedback loop?
So I'm thinking about a feedback loop in the context of 82% of new companies that are started, and I'm just looking at the SaaS world because I got this statistic directly from Y Combinator. 82% of YC companies are started remote or hybrid today, last quarter. Pre-COVID, 16% of companies were being started remote or hybrid. So we're seeing new companies have said, of course we want to start remote because that's how our business model works. And all of the people that we want to hire want to be able to work remotely, those top A players inside of the industry. But when you look at corporate America, Fortune 500 companies as an example, that is a complete reversal. So the majority of those people don't actually want to be able to work remotely. And or well, the management team doesn't want to actually have the employees work remotely. And it's funny because I'm very specifically saying the management team. The executive team actually wants to work remotely. The employees want to work remotely. It's the management layer that doesn't want to have their employees work remotely. And we can get into that if you want. But essentially, what we're looking at here is a bunch of managers that have recognized, and this is a central thesis of the book that I wrote. Managers are no longer needed as much as they were pre-pandemic, particularly if you're running a hybrid work environment. And therefore, they need to transition to a more of a leadership model than a management model. And I do think that there's a very clear difference between those two. And a lot of managers are saying, I don't want to. So I'm going to continue to have you guys sit back in the office, do the presentism that everyone does, which is I'm just going to show up at the office. I'm going to quote unquote work late, but really I'm going to play solitaire on my computer till 9 o'clock at night. And everyone will think I'm a rock star as opposed to actually doing work and producing real outcomes for the organization. If I'm getting a little too fundamentalist for you, please stop me. I do a lot of these types of presentations and I thought I could just be direct with you, Dart, and not give you the sugar-coated version of reality.
Well, and you mentioned something in the book, which is measurement by presence as a false measurement of productivity. Before we go on, there's a couple of things in there that you mentioned. One is new companies don't have 20-year leases. New companies don't have the sunk cost of a big physical plant that it hurts them in their hearts to see unused. And so new companies are in a position to do it differently. And they also know, and I think this is super important, that if you're a startup, you're going to pull top talent and just don't care where they are. You know the 20 top people you want. And if they're in the Arizona mountains or, you don't care. And so you assemble that core team, it's going to be remote, and it makes your venture capital just go a lot further. So it makes total sense.
Absolutely. I think the other part to kind of add on to this is the old head of remote of GitLab, Darren Murph, gave me a really good analogy, which is remote as it stands now, and particularly what I believe is the methodology behind remote, which is asynchronous management, is like the Model T rolling off the production line. Really, essentially, 2020 was when that first Model T rolled off the production line. And we're starting to see all of these new upstarts, right? Those early adopters, those new companies that are being built, saying, of course I'm going to run remote. This is the better business model because if I'm as innovative as you, if I'm as scrappy as you, if I'm as hardworking as you, just by implementing a remote model, I'm going to actually be 30% more productive and efficient. So compounding over 1,000 companies, the remote organizations are going to go to the top. And so I'm really terrified for those companies that have not adopted this model. And in 10 years, the next McKinsey, as an example, that's running remotely, or the next Deloitte that's running remotely and adopting this type of model and saying, yeah, we can do really expensive consulting for you for 50 cents on the dollar because our workers love to work for us and they don't like to work for Deloitte. Shout out to Deloitte. They're actually not very positive about remote work, to be honest with you. That's the type of situation that I think a lot of these companies will be stuck in a really tough spot because they're given this opportunity right now to be able to make that type of transition. And it's just really, really difficult for an on-premise org to transition to remote. It's much easier for a company to start remote than it is to transition to remote. And I think this is essentially the big difficulty that we're currently seeing. But they need to make that transition in order to actually succeed and develop the next 10 years of their business model long-term.
When it comes to the infrastructure of remote, I realize that I'm conflating two ideas. And what I'm conflating is there's the infrastructure of gig work, and then there's the infrastructure of remote. And so what I've been seeing on the rise is the infrastructure of gig work, which is that supports digital nomads. I guess they support both. So an example is we're going to have a school that is available around the world. And people can travel around the world and their kids will have the same curriculum and they can travel with their peer group if they want. And we see the rise of things like it's essentially health insurance that is global.
Safety Wing.
Thank you, Safety Wing. That's right.
Great sponsor of Running Remote. Have been there every year. Very much appreciated.
So there's infrastructure, but it helps in two different ways. One is it destabilizes the competitive advantage of wage labor as opposed to gig work. Because all of a sudden, I don't have to work full time for a company to have health insurance that can do what I need it to do. So I want to go back and say, and this is why I ask you this question, is I'm largely asking a question about your advertisers, which is because you have your fingers on the pulse of who's advertising the infrastructure of remote. And so
who's building out the pipes?
Yeah, what is emerging there?
So I would probably say, and there are a couple issues that are just very, very boring. I call them the bureaucracy of remote that is getting solved. And they aren't sexy ideas, but they are building multi-billion-dollar businesses underneath this infrastructure. Biggest one is paying people. So payroll is probably the biggest shift that I've seen in the last 3 years. We've had companies like Deal, Remote.com, Globalization Partners, Oyster. These are all multi-billion-dollar valuation companies that have all been started during the pandemic. And they've all raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And essentially what they solve for is we have team members in 46 different countries all over the world. We have a combination of contractors, subsidiaries, and full-time employees inside of the United States. Our main corporation is located in the United States. We have a subsidiary in Canada, which is where I'm located. I'm paid by that subsidiary. These types of companies, which are called EORs, employer of record companies, allow for you to be able to employ someone in any country on planet Earth legally to be able to make sure that their payroll is done properly, they have their health insurance set up properly, they're paying the right government services. Because essentially what happens is if you're big enough, I have a story of a very, very large client where there were a few hundred support reps that were wintering in Spain. A whole bunch of people in their support department were like, let's go to Spain for the winter. And they actually had a great time. They all stayed in the same city and they all kind of stayed within 2 to 3 blocks. I mean, talk about company culture, right? It's like all of these employees are going to travel together to Spain, bring their families, invest billions of dollars into the Spanish government and the economy. And then the government of Spain proceeded to sue this corporation for payroll taxes because you worked for longer than 3 months in that country, even though you're working from home. So they were all being paid directly in the United States. They were still running their payroll through the United States, but the Spanish government said, no, you owe us payroll taxes plus arrears and damages on it. And so these cases are what terrifies Fortune 500 companies and are saying, listen, we'd love to have our people work remotely. But the reality is that I run a $4 billion company and I, at any single year, have $600 million worth of payroll costs that could end up costing me 800, 900 million more than what I'm currently paying, because if we make a mistake, we can't really manage all of these people that are over planet Earth. So these EORs really solve that problem for them. And there are a lot of people that are currently in the space that are trying to solve it. I think there's going to be a lot of mergers that happen probably in the next 18 to 36 months, particularly as we've dropped off of the height of remote work. And now we're going to see the slow, precipitous return back to remote work being a lot more popular. But that's a big one. Project management, huge. It was already huge pre-COVID, but it got a lot bigger. That's another big piece of it. And then as an offshoot of that, which is something almost specifically adopted by remote and hybrid organizations, is process documentation. So the ability to be able to actually build out processes inside of your organization and communicate that information. I talk about in the book how I believe that the platform should be the manager, not the individual. How many PTO days do I have? Oh, you have 7. Well, no, you could actually just query project management system or an HRIS tool to be able to get that information, as opposed to interrupting your manager to be able to get that information back. So that's a big feedback loop. And then we've already laid out the infrastructure of Zoom. Zoom did really well, obviously, during the pandemic. They're a great partner of Running Remote. Their COO spoke at our conference. But the reality is that I actually think we need to see a lot more innovation happen in that space over the next few years. And there's a lot of dead bodies trying to figure out how to create sense of presence inside of virtual communication. Meta being a perfect example that just spent how many billions of dollars trying to build VR headsets for everybody, and it didn't really work out. Apple is now committing the future of their business model towards this sense of presence. I think if anyone knocks that one out of the park, it will be a complete game changer. And you're probably going to see not just that hybrid model, because that hybrid model is dependent upon individuals spending at least one day a week doing that collaboration day. If you can build that sense of presence as much as in person, then that will disappear and that'll really accelerate remote work. So those are a couple examples of the pipes that I really see.
A lot of my experience with various kinds of remote came from Cisco Systems, and Cisco Systems created a whole product line around telepresence. And telepresence is super high-end video conferencing, but it still is attached to equipment. And so one of the things they did, and it was exciting at the time, which was that they had these robots that you could remote control, and they were just a telepresence unit on rollers. By the way, this is what a robot is going to say to you the first time it talks to you, which is this thing trundled up behind me. It was very quiet. And I turned around and there was this guy on a screen right behind me. And he says, "Hey, how's my sound?" That's what the future looks like, by the way, is robots saying, is my sound, can you hear me? And that was actually the VP of Advanced Technologies on the screen talking to me. Now, the transition here is through project management. And by the way, you said that employer of record was not sexy. I think that's very sexy. If you've ever set up a legal entity in another country and you've tried to get the laws right to make it so that you can have legal employees in that space, somebody coming along who says, look, we've already got it set up. Like I've just recently done a lot of research on Globalization Partners who does this. And they're going to say to you, you don't have to know those laws back and forth. You don't have to set up a legal entity. We're going to actually be a platform for you in that country. Very sexy. It just different ideas of what's hot.
And the other thing too, for people that are really looking at the EOR space, and again, they're all very happy customers of ours, so I can't really necessarily speak negatively about any in particular. But what I would say is it's very important to recognize what type of product you need dependent upon the situation that you're in. Do you need a contractor? Do you need a full-time worker? Which countries are you actually hiring from? I had a friend of mine who sold his company for $110 million. And it was and that's like a decade-long project for him. And this was his train coming to the station. And one of his engineers worked in an Eastern European country where the laws for contractors stated that the contractor owned all of the intellectual property that they produced for the corporation that they worked for. So an engineer essentially owns the code base because you can't undo the code base.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So contractor, they're going through due diligence and they say, hey, there's this problem. This person basically owns your tech stack. We need to work this out before you get acquired. So they get their lawyers and they talk to this engineer. And this engineer was very smart. He lawyered up immediately and he said, no problem. I would happily sign that piece of paper for you in exchange for $5 million. And they paid him and he signed away, his code base. And there we go. But those are the types of mistakes that if they had spent $100,000 on Globalization Partners, they wouldn't have incurred a $5 million bill later down the road. So that's the type of thing that you need to take into consideration. Just because you know US payroll law does not mean that you know Nigerian payroll law, which is very, very different. And it looks alien to what you would have in the United States.
Do you remember what country that was by any chance?
I can, but I don't want to disclose that because I don't want to give too many details to my friend who actually ended up, he had a great exit, but for him, it was the other thing that was actually quite interesting about this particular exit is the acquirer held 20% of the acquisition back for payroll taxes over the next 5 years because they were scared that one of these countries would sue them for payroll taxes and said, we're going to give you your big nut. We're going to give you your $80 million. We're going to keep this 20 million in reserve for the next 5 years. And maybe that doesn't necessarily make a big difference to everyone, but it's just an extra hassle that you can honestly solve for 50 grand a year running a large company working with, one of these EOR companies.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's all new information to me. That kind of risk and that kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk about the contents of your book, Running Remote. And importantly, it was originally going to be titled Async. I like this title. I think it's a great title. But the key idea in there is the culture of asynchronous work. Why asynchronous?
So before the pandemic, I arguably probably spoke to more remote first founders and operators than anyone that I know in the industry. And one of the things that I found so interesting in figuring out how they ticked was that the vast majority of those organizations were running what I named in the book as asynchronous management, which is the ability to be able to manage people without doing what we're currently doing right now, which is we're communicating synchronously, but the person that's consuming this podcast is consuming it asynchronously. So the ability to be able to communicate in a way that doesn't require time dependency is a critical aspect of how they built their businesses and scaled their organizations. And when I saw this, I thought to myself, well, this is the operating system for remote. The operating system for remote is asynchronous, almost to a degree to which there was the 2019 version of Running Remote. The attendees said, enough with the async stuff. 70 to 80% of the talks are all about asynchronous management. But the reality is that that's what we all really wanted to talk about and what we were very passionate about, building out this way of thinking and operating. And so when COVID hit, no one knew how to manage remote workers. They just thought, oh, well, it's just like the same thing as in the office. It's just we talk to them on Zoom as opposed to talking with them in the office. Well, seeing how your day is going while you're walking by the hallway is completely different from getting a ping on Slack or Microsoft Teams saying, hey, can I talk to you for 10 minutes? Number one, the employee is terrified. I'm going to get fired, obviously. I have no context of what the heck this is actually about. But then secondarily, it is a disruption towards their workday that's much more disruptive than that quick, oh, hey, how are you doing? Yeah, what's going on with the marketing announcement email that we're supposed to put out next week? And I have a friend of mine, Cal Newport, and he actually wrote the blurb on the front of the book. He wrote a book called Deep Work, which is essentially the methodology of asynchronous management, but for the individual. And what I've realized is that the more that you can maximize someone's workday towards focused work on a difficult problem, the faster your organization will grow without distractions. And so if you optimize your entire organization, your workforce towards that singular goal, then you will grow much faster than if you spend, and I don't know if you know the statistic, Dart, but the average amount of time spent on video calls for newly remote companies right after COVID was 56% of their work week, which kind of seems scary when you think about it. You're spending more than half of your work week talking about work, and you're spending, 10, 15 hours actually doing the work. That's very psychologically jarring for people. It's just very stressful. And, there's a reason why we had Zoom fatigue as a term in 2021. It's because people don't want to interact that way. They want to be able to have deep, focused, intimate conversations with people. And they don't want to kind of sit on Zoom calls for 3 or 4 hours a day about stuff that's really not important towards them achieving their goals inside of the organization. So asynchronous management essentially allows for people to be able to optimize an environment where you wouldn't necessarily need to talk to anyone in the organization if you needed to in order to actually do your job. However, it makes you a much better worker and collaborator if you do, but you need to do it in the right way. You need to be able to talk to build connection. You need to communicate to build connection and collaborate deeply with people, not necessarily whether or not we're going to have Times New Roman or Arial as the font on an email. blast that goes out.
Yes. And really this way that we're talking right now is synchronous. To move communication into asynchronous, there's a whole set of skills and norms that go with that. What are some of those?
So let's take the context of this podcast as a perfect example. If we were to do this in a very asynchronous way, what we could have done is I could have fired up an Asana deployment with you, which is my project management system of choice. You can use whatever you want, but I like Asana. And we would come up with, what are the questions that Dart wants to ask me? And then I could actually start responding to that in the comments section of each of those questions asynchronously. And then we could have debates about that. And maybe we even bring in your producer, or I bring in someone from my research team. We say, oh, you know what? It'd be really great if we got some statistics connected to this particular question. Let's make sure that we reference those. Yeah, there's a piece from The Economist and The New York Times that we could pull in. Do we really want to talk about that issue? Or maybe we shouldn't really, touch on it at all for the pacing. So we could go through this process, but we've never actually communicated synchronously at any point throughout that process. But what it would produce is a podcast, which is much better for the reader, much better for us, probably a lot more fun for us to be able to go through, and much more engaging. We do this all the time inside of our companies. We have something that we talk about in the book, which is silent meetings. So we'll have issues that we want to be able to talk about, agendas, issues that we have inside of the organization. We have an app called Fellow that we use for this. And if we have less than 3 issues on the agenda, our Google Calendar automatically deletes that meeting so that we just don't have to actually show up for it. And funnily enough, the issues that stay on the agenda are almost entirely human-centric. So I've also realized that talking about issues that are like, what kind of changes do we want to make to this feature, as an example? Very, very simple to solve, can perfectly be solved asynchronously, and you shouldn't be wasting valuable synchronous time when you could instead be talking about Dart has an issue with Liam, and the team dynamics here don't work, and we need to be able to make sure that we've come to a conclusion with Dart and Lindsay and gotten them to settle their beef, as an example. And that's the piece that was another big learning for me. Just because we're running async doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't human conflicts like you would have inside of regular organizations. It just shines a light on the most important issues, which is managers should be focused on human dynamics and human-centric problems, as opposed to the nuts and bolts of the business, which essentially get solved. The big thing that holds companies back, departments back, is that team working together and making sure that they work efficiently. And so we try to reserve as much time as we possibly can to discuss that and forget about everything else.
What I like about that is this idea that synchronous time is expensive. And so let's create systems that are going to monitor our use of synchronous time. And when I was at Cisco, one of the things that happened, I think this must have been in 2008, is all of a sudden we didn't have budget for travel, but we had these incredible video systems, these incredible telepresence systems. And so the global mandate was no travel. There's going to be no travel. And so my manager said to me at the time, I was about to run this big strategic meeting, and she said, can you just solve the time zone thing? My first response was actually, no, can't. The Earth is a sphere. The sun shines on one side. People sleep on the other side. That's the way. And so I thought maybe she'll just forget about it. Well, she didn't. A couple weeks later, so have you solved the time zone thing? So I went back and I said, okay, maybe it's possible. And what I realized is that meetings that we run are structured into breakouts and sessions where we discuss the breakouts. And you could distribute the breakouts around the world. And then you could have the group discussions, which was very precious time when there was overlap between the different countries. And you'd focus just on essentially merging all the different tracks of breakouts. And then we'd launch into another around the world, follow the sun segment of the meeting. And what I realized at the time was that, and wrote a paper on it, which was you shouldn't think of virtual work as lesser in-person work. It's a different medium, and different media have different advantages. And one of the advantages of electronic communication is that it can all be recorded. And so we did something I think that's very similar to what you propose. And I'm going to go through some of your principles here, which is we were mostly asynchronous. We had a text layer that moved around the world and was this one body of text. And you mentioned very deliberate and purposeful communication as one of your key tenets. And we passed video report outs from time zone to time zone. So at the end of it, we would record a report out from a team that said, look, we did this and here's our breakout said this. And we optimized those scarce synchronous times. So you've got deliberate, purposeful communication, largely written. I mean, that's like a principal skill.
Absolutely. The ability to be able to disseminate information is critical. And there was a chapter that we left out of the book. Not my choice, actually. It was Harper's choice. I looked at 20 different companies and I tried to run basically a program where I would shift them into asynchronous management. I just decided, based off of talking to a bunch of other experts in the field, to define a quantifiable number, which was 20% of their workday is spent on synchronous forms of communication and 80% of their workday is spent on asynchronous. And that was organizationally wide. So we looked at all of the time that they spent on video calls, basically. And it was a complete failure. We actually only got 9 companies that reduced their time of synchronous communication. 4 companies increased their amount of synchronous communication once they were aware of it. It was just very, very bad. And then the others just kind of remained the same. And what I learned from it was there were 3 core tenets that resulted in those failures. Number 1 was adoption of the executive team buy-in for this idea. There were a lot of 20th century MBA types that just said, no, we need to be able to just see them. And that's how we're going to make sure that that works, gets done. We need to see them on video calls to give me the report as opposed to just typing the report into a project management system and getting that information asynchronously. The second one was the ability to build out process documentation. That was actually incredibly difficult. But the third one, which was even more interesting, because you think process documentation is very clear, the third one was querying that process documentation. So we identified with one of these companies, 96% of the process documents, and they built a couple hundred of them, were never accessed more than once because no one actually knew where they were. So there was no one giving people the directions to figure out where they go. So the dissemination of that information is really important, but the ability to be able to query that information is also really important. And that's the piece that no one has actually really cracked yet, to be honest with you. If I think about the tip of the spear, and there are a couple companies that are doing it right now, Slight is a really good process documentation company that is using LLMs, large language models, to be able to actually look at your process documents and say, let's interpret those process documents for the end user. So you just have a happy little Slack bot that says, how many PTO days do I have left? You have 7. Would you like some more? Here's how to apply for more. That type of a thing. And I think that that's a really interesting future direction. That's going to be the last nail in the coffin towards the further expansion of remote work, because it's just that synchronous dependency on the manager. They've had that power over the worker for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now we'll be able to reverse that model, which is the manager will become digital and they'll be able to get all the information that they need, the employee, to be able to do what they want to do to get their work done.
That's a very interesting approach, which is basically to say a lot of what managers are required for synchronously is, what should I do next? And what you're saying is, no, we actually capture that in a more durable way. And I thought one of the really interesting things that you pointed out is that the process documentation shouldn't be tops down. It should be something that everybody in the organization can actually modify, and that it be shared and say, hey, we'd like to change the process in this way, bottoms up. And everybody else that's working there can say, good idea or bad idea, vote it up or down, and then make the change. And I think that's very powerful.
Well, it empowers people to be very autonomous and gets them really engaged inside of the organization. One other factor that I need to really reinforce, all of these companies had a very strong vision, mission, and values inside of what they did. They created a business environment in which every single person in that organization knew why they were there, knew the work that they were doing was important, and knew how it served the higher vision and mission of the organization. So if you don't have that, none of this stuff that I'm talking about is actually going to work, to be completely honest with you. Because why would I bother rebuilding process documents if I don't really care about what I'm doing inside of the organization? You don't, right? But a lot of these people were very passionate. I like to lovingly call it, they all drank the same Kool-Aid, right? They're all part of the same cult, and they're all really excited about the mission of the organization. As I said, ours is to empower the world's transition towards remote work. And so, of course, they're all really excited about building out that process documentation and making sure that it evolves so that the organization can be successful long term. But by providing that bottom up approach, it gives people the sense of autonomy to be able to say, yeah, I'll just change it because it's really bugging me. And I need to go out and change it because it doesn't work for me. And I'm sure that there are other people that agree with me, or maybe disagree with me, and you can debate it. Wikipedia is the model that I use. If you look at the back of any Wikipedia page, you'll actually discover these really intensive debates about what should go on the front of the Wikipedia article. Go take a look at Donald Trump's Wikipedia page. Epic. There's an Encyclopedia Britannica of debates about what should be on the front page of Donald Trump's page. I actually looked at this a couple weeks ago for another podcast, and there are hundreds of people that have commented on the January 6th coup, the attack on Washington. And I don't want to get necessarily too political here, but there were hundreds of people that are commenting back and forth saying, no, this is not, this shouldn't be on there. This line shouldn't be on there, that type of a thing. So it's debating those issues. And one of the best process documentation tools that we had from the very beginning, we don't use it anymore, was a open source Wikimedia system that we could use. And you literally it's open source. You can install it on your own server. And it worked very well for us for a long time, but we needed a more kind of scalable system to be able to use. And we moved off of it. But yeah, that type of documentation is really, really powerful. And when people can change the documentation, they feel really empowered to actually do it and keep all your documents up to date.
We are actually going to get into politics in just a second.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what this reminds me a lot of is it reminds me a lot of the work of Colonel John Boyd. He essentially revolutionized military strategy in the United States by pointing out that the military is much more effective when it can distribute agency away from a command and control model to a much more distributed model. And that a lot of what makes that possible is communication between platoons out on the edge. But when they see an opportunity, they have a fingertip feel, is the way he put it, for what's actually going on in the field. And they're able to respond much more quickly than by going back to a command and control model and updating what they're doing. And so he had two main concepts in there. One of them was what he called recon pull, as opposed to command push. Command push is there's going to be a general who's going to tell you what to do. They're slow, they're out of date, they are not as effective as recon pull, which is people in the field making decisions. But in order for them to do it, second big concept was mission commands. And mission commands were, don't just say, look, you need to take Hill 5. Say, you need to take Hill 5 because that overlooks a supply chain that we need to take control of. If you can take control of the supply chain in some way, some supply road, you don't have to take that hill. And so it was very much like what you said. It's about pushing accountability and expertise and agency out to the edge. And this is where I get into sort of political notes anyway. A lot of the people you interview in Running Remote have what I would consider a political reason for remote, which is it's anti-authoritarian. It strikes me. A, it's very communitarian. We're going to help each other. We're going to work together in the field. We don't need a command and control structure above us that's telling us what to do. And my question is, it's not surprising in one sense, which is the people who are going to be farthest out on the edge are going to do it for a sort of zeal that's beyond just, how they work during the day. It's going to be a bigger zeal. But A, do you agree with that characterization? And B, are they necessarily together?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that, and I'm framing this through the context of the customer that we serve are remote founders. And I would probably say, if I were to just focus in on that group and talk about their personality traits, any entrepreneur would be just don't tell me what to do, right? I'll tell you what I did. And don't tread on me type of mindset. So I think that that's probably in all entrepreneurs, not necessarily remote ones. But there is a certain flavor. I can definitely tell you that that applies to digital nomads. They have a big belief in saying no borders. And I agree with some of the things that they say and disagree with some of the other things that they say. I think that borders are really great for a lot of good reasons. To be honest with you, it's like making sure that, I don't have someone that breaks into the back of my house and steals my stereo is great. I like to pay taxes in a society in which can have police and social workers and infrastructure in order to be able to make that happen. I live in Canada. It's a great place to live. And living in Jakarta, as an example, would be a lot tougher, right? For me. That's why I choose to live in Montreal and not Jakarta. But I think that I think you're probably right up until 2020. And I think probably right now we're going through a transitionary stage where I really see that there's like four epochs of remote work. Epoch one was basically just some engineers back in the early 2000s that were just saying, I want to work remotely. And there's some open source projects. I really kind of see like the basis of remote work started from the open source movement. Applications like WordPress, as an example. And WordPress is, before COVID started, was one of the largest remote first organizations on the planet and an asynchronous organization. The second epoch was, wow, this remote work thing is starting to work out and people are excited about it. And digital nomads appear because they want freedom and flexibility and they want location freedom and flexibility and they want to be able to essentially have their cake and eat it too. So that was the next big stage. Then we kind of rolled up into a couple companies were starting to do this in a serious way. One of the biggest ones was Shopify ended up taking their entire support team remote back in 2018. And we actually interviewed their head of support. And the talk is still available on the Running Remote YouTube channel, which took 5,000 reps remote. So that was that second epoch, moving into the third, which was COVID. And that's emergency remote work. And now the current epoch that I think we're sitting in is the epoch of the reality setting in for the vast majority of these companies, realizing, man, this thing that we kind of just pulled the trigger on 3 years ago really quickly because we were forced to, we now really can't put the genie back in the bottle. And there's a lot of these hard conflicts that are starting to occur. So I'm actually thinking right now, at least the type of people that we're trying to have come to Running Remote, we want to be able to make sure that it's a broad tent for everyone, but it is also showing people that there are various different ways of achieving remote work. Someone suggested that we should remove remote from Running Remote. And I said, no, we're just going to keep that because that's the core of our DNA. But really, it would be just allow people to work flexibly. And I think that large corporate America and the Fortune 500 globally are probably, as I said, going to come to terms with that a lot slower than the young upstarts. So we'll still have that nucleus of young upstarts that you're kind of talking about, but we want to be able to pull in the larger companies because from a pragmatic perspective, us firing up Volkswagen as an example and allowing people to work remotely for Volkswagen is a much bigger win than getting a company of 100 people to be able to work remotely. I mean, both is a win, but for us, we're realizing the fastest way to achieve our goal is to talk to large corporates. So we're trying to make that shift, but it's interesting that you've detected that because that might be something that we need to go back and actually think about again as it connects to our brand and who we are, because we're realizing that, if it's a vinegar versus honey type of conversation, we want to be able to make that type of conference as palatable as humanly possible for the companies that are really going to take remote work where it needs to go.
Yeah, that's right. So Couple closing questions. One of the things that I thought reading some of the originators of remote work is that the sort of death to the man vibe that came through some of the earliest folks was probably not a great marketing brand for the man. And
Yeah, you're
so,
right. You know what? You are absolutely right. So one of the miscalculations that we've made inside of running remote, and particularly it was so clear to me at our last event that we did, was I was talking to the remote work consultants. And the remote work consultants have been telling me, number one, do not use the word remote. Remote is bad, scary word. Use the word distributed. Distributed, everyone's distributed, right? If you're a multinational, you're distributed. And I thought, okay, that was an interesting perspective, but we really just got to stick to who we are. And maybe that just even proves your point, which is like, screw it. I'm just going to continue to call it whatever I want to call it and continue on to do it. And if you wanted that information, you can. But there were definitely, whenever you get a whole bunch of entrepreneurs together, I mean, they're generally pretty hard-headed people that want to do it the way that they want to do it. And they don't want other people telling them what to do. So that's really good notes for me moving forward.
I ask a question of everybody at the end of the show because I do market research about what people want from work. And my marketing question is, what job do you, Liam, hire your job to do for you?
Oof, well, I would probably say if I was not the founder of the business, it would be to make sure that I'm keeping body and soul together and I'm being paid, right? But that's not what I do. I think for me, it is a vehicle to hopefully realize my vision. And my vision is the company's vision. So that's what I get really excited about. When I get an email from someone saying, you've completely changed my life. I had someone at Running Remote in Montreal back in 2021 that stopped me and he said, I didn't know anything about you 2 years ago. And I now have a team of 800 people. I didn't have a business before that point. I'm running these 7 companies. You know, I'm doing $50 million a year. And it's totally based off of the methodology that you've set forth here. And that's the type of stuff that feeds me for months in terms of my passion and my belief that everyone should have the ability to be able to have the opportunity to work remotely. You know, someone else gave me a really good quote on this, which is if your vision and your mission doesn't give you goosebumps, then you need to get a better mission or vision. And it's just like, I just want to do something that gives me goosebumps all day long and I'm very passionate about. So it essentially feeds my passion.
Do you have the sense that there's a criminal waste of human potential out there because of old ways of thinking about how work should be done?
Yes.
I'm sort of digging on what the vision is. What's the thing that's out of place that needs to be gotten into place?
So I'm a very patient man, and as I said, I'm doing this for almost 20 years, and I'm very happy to wait another 5 or 10 years before my vision is realized. And I'm not saying it's my vision. I'm saying it's the vision that I hope people like me and everyone else that attends our conference have in common, which is having a world in which everyone can work remotely if they want to. I think that makes for a much better world. I think that makes for much better citizens, much better parents, much better grandparents. I got an email from one of our team members' parents from India. And in India, it's a multi-generational home. So the child usually lives with the parents until adulthood. And only when they have children do they really kind of move out of the house. And he said, I really appreciate the work that my son does because I never really saw what he did until he was able to actually work entirely from home because they were actually working from a co-working space before that point. And COVID brought them back into the office. And I was so inspired by all of the things that he's been doing, that he has now started up his own little online business that he's running. And he's now working, the grandfathers or the fathers working from home. And it's just very inspiring to be able to see these types of things. I think the other part of this too is, yes, there's a huge waste inside of remote work. And when you said that, it almost immediately triggered my perspective, which is we're thinking about this from a very Western context. And when you think about all of the Einsteins that just haven't had the opportunity to be able to actually utilize their genius, that are located in Nigeria, or they're located in Indonesia, or they're located in Thailand, or somewhere else where they just haven't been able to get the opportunities to be their best selves. My perspective is that remote work empowers employers and employees to find the best of each other. And I think we're only starting that process now. And in the next few years, we're going to see a Cambrian explosion of these geniuses that will be able to explore their genius, because before they were essentially cut off from the Western socioeconomic system in order to be able to take advantage of it.
What does your job cost you?
It probably costs me, to a degree, a lot of my health. I think that was the first thing that kind of jumped into my head. Right after this, I'm going to CrossFit, which I would highly not suggest for people, by the way. It's very bad for you. It's like a very intensive workouts. But I started them 6 months ago.
It began here in Santa Cruz, by the way,
Oh, really?
and went out to put people into physical therapy all over the world.
Yeah. So the reason why I'm doing it is because I committed to going, I'm going heli skiing with my business partner mid-January for 3 days. And I said I needed to be able to prepare for it. But it gave me a really good excuse to say, I need to take a look at my health and figure out where I'm going. Pre-2020, I was 20 pounds lighter, and I need to be able to shift that. Takes time away from my kids. I've got 2 young kids. I'd like to be able to spend more time with them. But also, in comparison to working in an office environment, I'm able to spend way more time with my kids than I would like to. So you're always thinking, oh, I could always spend more time with my kids. Or I could have, instead of a 2-pack, I could have a 6-pack. But at the end of the day, those are things that I would happily give up in order to be able to serve the mission and vision of the company.
Yeah. And just to mention, you were a world-class athlete.
Yeah, that's true. I was a pair skater. So back until, I don't know if anyone remembers Sally and Peltier, the Canadians that ended up getting the silver at the Olympics when the Russians got the gold, and all of the drama that came from that. That was my last year competing internationally, which was exactly the right year to get out, to be honest with you.
And if you were competing internationally on the ice as Canadian, you were world class. And so, interestingly, I just interviewed another Canadian who was an Olympic sprint canoe. So this is the other thing that comes out of Canada besides great people on the ice.
Canoeing is big.
Well, yeah, canoeing. Exactly.
Canoeing's big. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. Where can people learn more about you, about your ideas, about the conference?
Sure. So runningremote.com, best place to be able to check out the conference. If you want to learn more about the book, it's Running Remote on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, everywhere else where books are sold. And if you are not really willing to make a commitment towards the conference itself, go to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/runningremote. All of our talks are up there for free, so you can get a good taste of what the conference is about before you want to make that commitment to go to Lisbon, which is happening April 22nd and 23rd of 2024. My brain is melting a little bit, but yes, it's those dates.
And for anybody who wants really structured information on how to roll something like this out, the book is Running Remote. The subtitle is Master the Lessons from the World's Most Successful Remote Work Pioneers. It's by Liam Martin and by Rob Rawson. Thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dart.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.